Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, and welcome back to the Truth in My Days Apologetics Program. Today, we have Dr. Adrian Torres speaking with John, and we will continue to explore alternate arguments for the resurrection that skeptics put forward, and why these are not valid. Hope you enjoy.
What other alternate theories for the resurrection are there?
The sixth one we'll look at is the so-called spiritual vision theory. And in this theory, Jesus never rose physically. He rose in some kind of spiritual sense, which might mean that he appeared as a spirit to them, or even just that they determined that they would carry on his teachings. This is the explanation for the resurrection.
So no physical resurrection at all, and that means the tomb should not be empty.
That's right. There's just absolutely nothing, I think, to this theory. It seems to me to be a complete failure. The gospel writers are very careful, repeatedly, to make it clear that the risen Jesus was physically present, bodily present. He was not just a spirit. That passage we saw in Luke 24, where he appeared to them and they think that it's a spirit. And he says, I'm not a spirit. I have touched me. I have flesh and bones. Spirits don't have these. He invited people to touch him. They're still not sure. He asks for some food to eat. Ghosts don't eat. In John 20, 24 to 29, after Jesus had appeared to the apostles, Thomas had not been present. And we read in this passage, now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. So he said to them, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace to you. Then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So it's very clear and undeniable that he was physically present. They touched him. They put their fingers into the holes, that hole in the side where the Roman spear went in, the holes in the wrists and the feet where the nails had gone, and he ate with them and so on. And furthermore, Jesus' own proof of his authenticity was that he would rise bodily. We see that in John chapter 2, verses 18 to 22. So anything less than that would not have been acceptable to the disciples. So here's the thing. You can't touch a vision. You can't eat with a vision. And as we said, that was Jesus' proof, a bodily resurrection.
That's obvious.
Yes.
And we must ask why the disciples would even want to carry on Jesus' teachings when he died and stayed dead, proving he was a false Messiah. They wouldn't they?
No, they wouldn't. They would have no reason to do that.
So what's the next theory?
The next theory, number 7, is the legend or myth theory. And that is that Jesus was an ordinary man. He was a preacher, teacher, had followers. He died like anybody else and was buried. And there was no claim that he rose from the dead, not immediately. But as time went by, as the decades went on, the original eyewitnesses died off. Eventually, these kind of legends began to develop around the character of Jesus, up to the point where they even invented this idea that he had risen from the dead. And it was to allow for this very thing that liberal scholars used to try to push the dating of the gospel books very, very late. Because if they were written long after the eyewitnesses were dead, the story could have grown in the telling. And that is why liberal scholars pushed, without any evidence, mind you, pushed the idea that the earliest gospel book was published 100 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. But this approach has fallen on hard times. As we mentioned elsewhere, manuscript discoveries in the 20th century show that all of the gospel books were published within the first century. Liberal skeptics generally accept this now. Very few of them would question it. But if they were all published in the first century, then they were all published in eyewitness times, which means any sort of legends that somebody might have proposed would have been debunked by these eyewitnesses. The actual dates of the gospel books makes this claim of legendary development thoroughly impossible. And furthermore, we know from the Roman historian Tacitus that the brutal and deadly Roman persecutions against the Christians started in the year AD 64. Now, according to the legend theory, the myth theory, at this time, the idea that Jesus had risen from the dead had not yet been created. So what exactly were the Christians dying for? What were they preaching? What was objectionable? Why were they giving up their lives for somebody who was just an ordinary preacher who died like anybody else and stayed dead? So this just does not make sense.
True, it doesn't make sense at all. What's the next theory?
Number 8, the wrong tomb theory, which simply says that when the women went to anoint Jesus' body, they got the tomb wrong. They went to a different tomb that happened to be empty, and that convinced them Jesus had risen. The disciples then went out, saw the empty tomb. They all thought Jesus was risen.
What about Peter running to check to see if what the women said were true?
Well, yes, they all went out to check. They all went to the wrong tomb. Peter was not present when Jesus was buried. So when the women said, this is the tomb, they just assumed that it was, accepted it. And so that's what convinced them Jesus rose. They all saw an empty tomb, mistakenly thinking it was Jesus' tomb, although it wasn't.
As you pointed out, the empty tomb didn't convince anyone. It was the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus that convinced the disciples. And there are no post-resurrection appearances according to this theory.
Well, exactly. That's one of the things that makes it a non-starter. If there are no post-resurrection appearances, nobody would believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
So what's the next theory?
We go on to number 9, which I call the swoon theory number 2. Return of the swoon theory. This one is not held by many people, but the idea here was that there was a plan to fake the resurrection. Jesus would be crucified, but the conspirators would remove him from the cross before he died, nurse him back to health to convince people that he'd risen. But the plan went awry. They did not foresee that a Roman soldier would actually stick a spear into Jesus' side, thereby actually killing him. And so they took the body, and the body was gone. They couldn't get the post-resurrection appearances because Jesus had unintentionally been killed. But still, with the empty tomb, this would have convinced people.
So that's just like another steal the body theory.
It is not steal the body theory with this added feature that it was planned.
I see. Well, that's just ridiculous.
Yes, because first they have to posit that there was this conspiracy. They have no evidence for that. Why should we believe that anybody had a conspiracy? There's absolutely no reason for it. And of course, if the plan did go awry when the Roman soldiers stabbed Jesus, we're back to the intractable problem that there are no post-resurrection appearances. So you see here how the theories are becoming more and more desperate and far-fetched.
I see a lot of your explanation to debunk these theories has to base on the fact that the empty tomb by itself cannot convince people that Jesus rose from the dead, and that we actually have to have the post-resurrection appearances to convince anybody at all.
Yes, I covered that in our discussion of poor arguments for the resurrection. The tomb was empty, no question about it. But as we pointed out, the empty tomb didn't convince Mary Magdalene. It didn't convince the women. It didn't convince the apostles, the possible exception of John. But across the board, it didn't convince anybody. They did not believe Jesus rose from the dead until he appeared to them alive. Until that point, almost any explanation for an empty tomb by itself is preferable to the idea that somebody rose from the dead. Now, most of these theories have other problems as well, which we've pointed out, but most of them also do stumble over this fact. They are unable to account for the post-resurrection appearances. Ones like the hallucination theory do, but they don't work for other reasons.
What's your next theory to debunk?
The next one, the identical twin theory, which simply posits that Jesus had an identical twin brother, and after Jesus was killed, the identical twin took his place, and that's why people thought he rose from the dead.
Sounds like a movie.
Even for a movie, I'm not sure a producer would take a chance on something like that, because this is more than just reaching. And the more you look into it, the crazier it becomes, for so many reasons. First, in Mark chapter 6, we see Jesus visit to the town of Nazareth in which he grew up. And this happens from Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6. Then he went out from there and came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this which is given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house." Now he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, and he marveled because of their unbelief.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part, same time and same place. If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.